Great. Well, thank you for those three very different and very, very fascinating perspectives on AI and creativity. I guess I'll start with you, Frederic. How would you, the past year and a half, we've seen this explosion of creative AI tools. And it really feels like we're at a sort of turning point. How would you describe this moment? And what do you think it says about where we're going next with how we use AI and our relationship with the technology and creativity?
Thank you. I think we're seeing the results of decades of work. We should be aware of that. So for example, so-called generative processes in AI in general, in computer graphics, have been around for at least 30 years or so or more. And it's more the sort of quantity or the accessibility of these results that now is out there. So we think that maybe it's all happening suddenly, but I think it's been a slow curve, and I would expect that that curve will keep going, basically. But maybe the boom that we just saw, it might taper a bit. So that's how I see things. But of course, I'm an insider and I've been involved, like I think all the speakers in these areas for a while. What I would like to point to, though, is that there are other domains where we will see impact that we've seen in so-called AI art in recent, you said, like the last 2-3 years. So I think what may happen is that we see a similar boom in other application areas. So I'm, for example, expecting that there will be a similar boom in robotics experiences. So what we see still at the level of individual or labs, I think will eventually arrive and be really out there. But again, it will be the result of decades of work.
Great. What I loved about your presentations was you both had robotics examples. So how are you thinking about generative AI, and has that changed the way you work or the equation at all?
Yeah, I've, likewise working in the space for quite a long time. And thinking about the previous question as well, I think what's really exciting about this recent boom, which is on the backs of decades of computer science research and data accumulation, is I think there's something really exciting about the new relationship between text and image, and the sort of proliferation of that in wider culture that enables people who might not natively have a visual expression practice to be able to express their complex ideas in a visual form. I think that's really that aspect of generative AI, different from generative art, which is a industry that I definitely hail from. But the application of generative AI in the context of text and chat and prompts is really, really intriguing. Obviously, there's ethical concerns around authorship and data and not exploiting existing artistic practices. But I think, and that shouldn't be undermined or under-examined. But I do think that new burgeoning creative flow and feedback loop is really, really empowering for some people. Gosh. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, great. When I was looking you present your creative robotic art Roombas, made me think how much, how do you feel, what is your relationship with these machines? Like how much control, for example, would you be willing to give them?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about the improvisation in the work and sort of the history of improvisation and performance practice is it's never about control. I think in industrial manufacturing applications, it is about control and precision, but this is a different type of paradigm. I think there's so much about a different type of embodied muscle memory that I'm quite interested in, an embodied understanding, a spatial understanding that I find really exciting, that creates novel use cases in the field of robotics, and data science, but also as a performer. So I love that sort of trifecta of creative and research challenges in that space. And yeah, it's a different way of thinking about a landscape painting, a different way of thinking about engaging with urban flow, and it's, yeah, we're just getting started.
Great. And Steve, you mentioned generative AI in your presentation, and gaming is one of the fields where people see a lot of exciting things, potential. Are you using generative AI, or how could you use generative AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think for the industry, it feels like while the technology has been in slow growth, and with GANs maybe being the first example of generative really hitting a public consciousness, last year I think everything changed for the industry. And every company is re-examining how it might use this technology. There are some serious concerns though. And right now we can't use generative AI in our business because the question of ownership and copyright hasn't been resolved.
Yeah.
And that's probably the most fundamental question of all. And I'm not quite sure how it gets resolved. And certainly we're watching all the different court cases that are going on around the world to see what happens next. And even the US Copyright Office has sort of, they've made a couple of different statements recently, which is very hard to work with. So we're certainly exploring generative AI, and our teams are having as much fun as I think anybody who's used Midjourney or DALL-E 2 is having, and using it as a sort of an idea generation tool. But in terms of actual production grade content, no, we have no plans to use it until such time as that ownership issue can get resolved.
Great. And a lot
Appreciate
of
that.
And a lot of artists, are suing these tech companies, are feeling a lot of anxiety of being replaced or having their intellectual property stolen. Where do you land on that? How do you feel about this? And
Wouldn't it be crazy if I said not on the side of the artist? That would be awful.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more.
No. I definitely, of course, we have to think about the values that we bring into the world through these disruptive new technologies. And of course, I think about in a really visceral way this combination of technology and tradition, but there is a political manifestation of that. There's an economic manifestation of how we balance this preservation of tradition while still being quite open to the imaginative and transformative possibilities of technology. So obviously I side with, it's not that binary, but I think there's really interesting artists like Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst who are trying to think about that authorship and that economic incentive from the level they created a company around that nature of governance and how we build those financial incentives into the model themselves. So I think it's a really fascinating. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it would be a really fascinating time to try to define the landscape that protects artists and creative people while still allowing them to create work at a larger scale.
Great. I'd like to take some audience questions. Yes, I think you had your hand first, and then you can after.
I'd like to ask Steve a question. So is one of the things that you try to optimize with AI the number of hours that players play these games? If so, are you worried about that at all? And do you take steps to limit it? There might be some individuals who become addicted.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question we frequently do get asked. The answer is our games aren't really designed to be played for very long. In fact, most play sessions are less than 30 minutes. There are players who enjoy playing them more, no question about it. And we have ways of identifying people where we think this might be becoming problematic, and that's part of how we run our business. We also have a player community that's super active as well, that self-helps. People sort of work through some challenges of having with the game through engaging with the community. I think having this level of observability makes it possible for you to have a highly curated experience where you take care of your players as well. And that's the relationship you want with our players.
Great. Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how you guys are...
Sorry, could you stand up?
It's interesting to see how you guys are using generative models and AI to sort of, I would say, mimic creativity. Because at its essence, I think it can be argued that creativity is sort of trying to explore outside the realm of things we've seen before. And I know a lot of generative models are really good at looking at the things they have seen before. So can you comment, I guess, all of you, can you comment on the possibility of having an AI model that is truly creative, that can expand on things it's seen to go outside of that realm, but still in a way that's in sort of, for instance, like Dali the painter, right? It's like outside of reality, but like that's a purposeful sort of thing that he uses. So can you comment on the possibility even of AI to do those kinds of things that generative models can't do?
Great, thank you. Frederic, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So that's a big topic. Probably could have a very long discussion and have very different perspectives. In a way, the technology we have now allow us to come up with some new effects and new artifacts. However, who decides what's interesting and creative and novel remains the human, at least as of today. So this is one aspect in AI systems that's, I would say, weak, and it's not because we don't try to build such AI systems, but it's a complicated topic, and we don't quite understand how humans judge this is really interesting or why. And of course, there are many sort of decisions that can be made about the same artifact by different humans. So for me, I see this sort of tension really interesting if we push it in the direction of, or if we see it in a positive manner, where these systems basically allow us to ask questions about our own creativity. Why do we think something is interesting or beautiful or different? So in that sense, it's helping us. Eventually, perhaps as we get more and more understanding, or we build these more and more sophisticated systems, they might start doing things that we didn't expect, really. And that's a possible future, but I'm not convinced that we're already there.
Great.
Just to sort of add to that, too, I think the relationship between creativity and context is really important. There's nothing about the output of, say, like Andy Warhol, to use something that's contested in the courts right now, that is this inherently creative in terms of its visual output, right? It is appropriation through and through, and we can kind of define what that. We can argue about that, but it's for its time, it was maybe deemed creative in the context of that cultural moment. And I think as human beings in society, we live in a society, we can kind of understand that context more, and we share that context, we create subcontext for that, and I think that is the thing that ends up being what we define as creative, whereas, there's nothing inherently about the outcome, even of human creative work, creative, if that makes sense.
Maybe in reference one of our sister companies, I work in King, but it's part of Activision Blizzard King. Blizzard is well known for having really amazing artists, and where the art in the game is celebrated and anticipated, I would say. And even if it were possible to generate all the content using AIs, I think we would have a very disappointed community of people if our artists weren't the ones who are in control and expressing their agency. And I think in art, it's as much about the relationship you have with the creator of that art as it is about the piece of art itself. And just as with chess, just because an AI can play chess better than a human doesn't mean you don't want to play against a human being. So I think that idea of the artist as the creator is something we still have a relationship with, and it's super important.
Great, thank you. And I'm sorry, we have time for one last question, and it's from the gentleman in the red shirt.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to think about rather a big question, that is, what model of art are we rolling through into this future? Thank you. We're a minority of two. If you look at the Renaissance definition of art, the 18th century one, the high modernism, they don't necessarily share anything in common. They're relative to the period which we're working with. Now we're channeling through this notion of art, which is the current one, which may work particularly well made art. And I'm asking myself, what happens if AI actually defines what the art is, rather than does it rather better than we do it? And the final part, deliberately provocative, is saying, what do I think of, and I'm an art historian by trade, what do I think of many of the technologically developed images, including AI? I would say they're technological kitsch. You really don't find any modern subtle interplay of human emotion, art, all the properties and so on. But my question is on my desire is to be careful about what role, or what definition of art do we roll through into artificial intelligence.
Thank you. Sougwen, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. No, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a really, again, I don't think it's worth it to be cavalier about what this, especially new wave of hype for generative models and AI art. For me, as someone, as I always think about drawing at the heart of what I do, and the Doug2 models, the AI models that I generate, they're of my own work. They're of my own drawing. I really think about the role of the data set and what is an ethical way to create meaning and artifacts and expression and narrative and creativity based on something that I based on my own drawings. I think one of the misconceptions to your point about generative visual work made by AI systems these days is this misunderstanding about a painting itself, right? Like a lot of the work that is, and the image models are trained on photographs of paintings, but not painting themselves. So I think a lot of the industry of what we would think of visually as AI art now is, it comes from a legacy of photography and of capturing that lens, but it's not painting. And I do think there's something really, which is that stewardship that I think about when bringing drawing and painting into the forefront of the work that I do, something very, really important to still think about and not erase, because it is something that people should be quite passionate about respecting, preserving, and evolving.
Great, thank you. Do you have something to add this, Frederic?
Thank you, Professor Kemp, for the topic. It's obviously a key one. I see the sort of the positive side of what's happening, and Sougwen just mentioned notions of archiving, for example. So in that sense, I think of archiving of how we produce art. So I think the domain is just opening many new areas that we maybe haven't really thought about yet carefully. A lot of focus is on redoing what we have seen before and doing it in spectacular ways. But there's also all this domain of what could we do that we couldn't do before. For me, that's where I try to go, and I think that's a very important area. And if we go there, then we can question, okay, what is art about, and what could it be next, rather than maybe do something which is sort of a redoing, a remashing of actuality.
Great, thank you. Now, I'll let you all go to a coffee break in a bit, but before we go, I'd like to hear a really, really quick tip from all of you. What's the one thing people should remember or pay attention to if they want to use AI as a creative tool? Steve, why don't you start?
I would say just learn the capabilities. Be open to what this can do as a tool. It's a tool today. It doesn't transcend that. But it's a really creative tool, and I think our ideas about what it can do, I think it's going to go way beyond that.
Perfect. Thank you. Perfect.
Yeah, I'd say think of it as a tool of the day, and how it can help you engage with practices that maybe you've stopped engaging since you were a kid, for example.
And Sougwen?
I guess. I mean, I'm not great with quick tips. I'm maybe a bit too long-winded for that. But I think it's important to not atrophy spatial, tactile, conceptual skills in services of computational ones. So always trying to find that balance and that unique hybridity that everyone has.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for our panelists, and thank you for the wonderful questions.